Well, if the current state of the world isn't getting you down between the pandemic, climate change, and whatever the hell this is, the new Lauren Southern movie just dropped. You know, Lauren Southern. She's the born-again centrist Twitch streamer who's less about spreading the great replacement conspiracy theory with Stefan Molyneux now, and a little bit more about writing children's books. When she's not taking time to edit her own Wikipedia articles to make her look a little less alt-righty, she's doing modern-day genocide denial in the form of the Canadian mass grave hoax. If you're new to her body of work, I highly recommend checking out Jose's documentary on her films, link in the description. He's done fantastic in-depth dissections of her work and the many ways she manipulates, distorts, and outright lies to push her narrative. In the case of the Canadian mass grave hoax, things are no different. We start with a montage as Lauren dramatically makes a case for the most persecuted class in Canadian history: Christians. Immediately out of the gates, the focus is put on the church burnings and the assertion that they're the direct result of a cultural awakening that took place in the aftermath of the discovery of multiple mass graves of Indigenous children across the country. Not to disparage Lauren's deep dive into the subject on encyclopedia.com, as it's what anyone would call a fair summary of the United Nations position on mass graves. She highlights the fact that it requires more than 3 bodies to be buried in the same location and emphasizes that it be victims of extrajudicial, summary, or arbitrary executions.
Definition by the United Nations states that mass graves include 3 or more bodies buried in one spot who were victims of extrajudicial, summary, or arbitrary executions.
Put a pin in that for now because we'll be returning to this document later. The media goes from reporting on the discovery of unmarked graves at the local level to internationally, and soon people are marching on the street in protests, and ultimately the entire thing is blamed on both the Government of Canada and the Catholic Church. It culminates in the inevitable backlash against empty or abandoned churches across the country going up in flames. It would appear the whole thing could also be part of a massive conspiracy, and the media was omitting key information. Lauren decides to take it upon herself to crack the case, and teams up with Keane Bexty, a self-described Albertan nationalist. He was also the Rebel News correspondent responsible for claiming that the Trudeau government's decision to make people arriving into the country during a pandemic stay at a 3-star hotel to avoid a possible contamination was akin to a gulag.
Justin Trudeau doesn't get to determine what goes in Keane Bexty's body. You know what? I don't give a shit. I'm going to go to a COVID jail. I was told that the locks had been removed from the doors. Did you hear that?
I'm sorry?
The locks have been removed from the doors. Locks, like deadbolts.
Not really.
Really hungry, haven't eaten, and just please give me a call when the food is coming.
Immediately, they just start asking questions.
Why would tribal chiefs be stating these were overgrown graveyards?
And then she sprinkles in a little dose of conspiracy theory.
And all before an election. Things were simply not adding up.
To lead us into a drone-laden intro. Lauren and Keane display their complete bewilderment that tribal chiefs and residential school survivors have no interest in talking to them, especially when a cursory Google search will reveal that Lauren has previously held interviews with such prestigious figures as Faith Goldie.
Of our people and a future for white children.
Yeah.
Is that controversial though? Like, I don't see that that's controversial. Is that bad? Like, I think it's controversial to say the opposite.
Holocaust denier, member of the identitarian movement, Martin Sellner.
No, but I think you're much fierce than many of the activists I know. But you're right, of course, it's a dangerous mission.
And Alexander Dugin, the founder of the National Bolsheviks Party, aka the Nazbols.
Normality today is matriarchy, feminism, LGBT, broadening the experience with drugs and so on. That is normal. That is almost obligatory for millennials.
There's actually several scenes of them mistaking people not wanting anything to do with them as potential cover-ups of something more sinister.
What are they hiding? Like, why are they so afraid to talk to media?
We've given them a month actually, and they're satisfied with the status quo. So that's the story, right? They're happy with you being misled.
Lauren is further confused when members of the local church won't comment immediately on a highly charged issue with a stranger who has only identified herself as a journalist named Lauren.
This topic, I literally hear like the soul leave their body when I ask about.
the church attacks or the residential school.
No one will talk to them, which surely can only mean that there's something else going on here. Which means it's as good a time as any to visit one of the actual grave sites and be as respectful as they can be by following the rules. No drone use, live streaming, video recording, photography, f that noise.
To launch the drone, to fly it over this area that a lot of people don't want to be seen for whatever reason.
GPR scan, which presumably led to these flag markings, was done by Dr. Sarah Bollier, who has since stated her findings are simply preliminary and cannot be confirmed yet.
In the following slides, I will call the targets of interest probable burials as they demonstrate multiple GPR characteristics of burials, but only forensic investigation with excavation will be able to conclusively determine this.
Now, Lauren only plays about 15 seconds of Dr. Sarah Bollier's 18-minute presentation and ignores the bulk with purpose, which is too bad because she does an excellent job explaining her methodology. GPR alone wasn't used to determine the presence of the bodies. The child's rib bone they'd found had already done that.
Part of the reason these 2 acres out of 160 were selected for this GPR survey was because a juvenile rib bone and a tooth were discovered.
In fact, the GPR wasn't used to detect organic matter at all. It was used to figure out exactly how large this particular unmarked graveyard of children was. That was combined with additional information such as accounts of survivors, historical documents, school records, and other testimonies to form a case. It's detective work and combines many of the tools of modern archaeology. Most importantly is the fact that the idea of missing and murdered Indigenous children is not new. It's been widely established by thousands of interviews in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. The survivors of this cultural genocide are still alive today.
For me, it is very hard to talk about it. I didn't even talk about the abuse in residential schools to my children. And today they're shocked to hear all what is happening, especially finding of the babies. Many of our children who ran away during the winter and froze to death on their way home. And the IELTS, the black robes, start lying about the children. Oh yeah, they're doing fine here. In the meantime, they were missing and no one had searched for them.
Nevertheless, the fact that she skips over the presentation can be forgiven as they state their next step will be to speak to an expert on the subject.
Some of those markers are like weirdly close to each other.
Now, what we need to do is speak to an expert on ground penetrating radar and see if that level of preciseness is accurate, or are they just putting stakes in the ground?
2 weeks later. Turns out, rather than speak to any experts, Keen has his own research he seems very confident about.
From the Journal of Applied Geophysics. This was from 2009.
Using the abstract of a study, aka the part before the introduction, they conclude that GPR technology often leads to incorrect results.
So yeah, one of those things that was repeated by almost every study and every expert, even the experts who did some of the research on these graves, was it cannot detect organic matter.
Yeah, no shit. GPR isn't a corpse machine. It detects anomalies in the soil. So for instance, if you dug a shallow grave and put a body in there and filled it with soil, it would detect a depression present that would appear different than had nothing happened at all.
But it wouldn't see a pile of bodies that has been there for 60, 70, 80 years. It's just not how GPR works.
Right. Yeah. From what I've seen, looking at some of the studies available online, really, it'll just show you anomalies in the ground. And this is even what Sarah Bollier.
It's at this stage that I'd like to point out that the description of our video contains a grand total of 0 links to any studies or reports, making it difficult to determine if she's read material on GPR or cereal boxes that have the letter G on them. Nevertheless, we found the study that Keen referenced and read as far as the conclusion, which states, "Our investigation showed that GPR surveys are useful tools for identifying unmarked graves and that the probability of detecting their correct location is very high under conditions mentioned in this paper." Even in the abstract itself, if they had just read past the first paragraph, they'd realize that GPR is intended to be compared with soil and vegetation properties of the sites examined. Which again, if they had played more than 5 seconds of Dr. Sarah Bolia's presentation, they'd realize she did.
With regards to determining number of graves, as I went through on the slides, it was ruling out different anomalies such as root systems, stones, rocks, anything else under the surface that didn't present as a potential burial. When you have a juvenile burial, because they are smaller in length, they typically are not dug as deeply. So the length would have been taken into account in addition to the depth of the burial as well.
The Smoking Gun finale, being the largest unmarked gravesite found near former Saskatchewan residential school, wasn't a mass grave at all.
These graves in Saskatchewan were apparently marked in the 60s. This was not a mass grave, it was a graveyard.
Yeah. Lauren, no shit. The news story never said it was a mass grave. Like, even the fucking headline. That again, using a combination of information provided by historical data, GPR, and even the goddamn Archdiocese of Regina, had revealed several of the graves had been bulldozed.
Firstly, a rogue priest with a bulldozer is not an intentional cover-up by the Catholic Church.
They never said it was a cover-up, just that it was literally covered up, like you're inventing your own conspiracy theory to have to debunk on top of proving your point. You even mentioned that the graveyard had started 13 years before the school opened. Again, no one is disputing that. It doesn't justify if children died at a residential school and were then buried in a gravesite that had their markers bulldozed because they didn't care.
You can't just rely on a couple squiggly lines to condemn a nation of genocide. That's not how it works. That's not what the science says. But time and time again, we see journalists misreading science. They don't know what they're talking about. They claim they do, but they're lying.
So, there's so much to unpack here, and unfortunately I won't have time to do it properly. The accusation of cultural genocide against the Government of Canada has already been established through the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. It was a multi-million-dollar investigation that had thousands of witnesses, testimonies, and conclusively determined that Canada intentionally enacted a program of cultural genocide against Indigenous peoples. This is in addition to the National Inquiry into Murdered and Missing Indigenous Women that also found the country to be guilty of cultural genocide. Both inquiries proposed multiple calls to action, from ending the widespread separation of children from their Indigenous parents, to reserves not even having enough clean drinking water, to address the ongoing problems, and very few of these calls to actions have been met. So, there you have it. Well, almost it. You see, remember when I said you should put a pin in what Lauren's definition of what a mass grave is? Well, that's because in the actual UN declaration itself, it clearly states that there is no clear definition of what they actually are. Now, I know it's pedantic to argue about definitions, but again, in your own example, if you just read past the first line, you'd learn several definitions of mass graves have been offered. From a scientific perspective, a mass grave contains 2 or more bodies that are in contact with each other. After all, it's archaeologists who are the ones examining the sites and using the definition openly. And better yet, that they don't have to be the result of extrajudicial, summary, or arbitrary executions, but can be from not having died in combat or armed confrontations. Like, holy hell, you highlighted it. At least read it next time. Oh, and you know how you said you were going to talk to an expert, but then just didn't? Well, I did. I spoke to several, in fact, like Jonathan Driver, professor of archaeology from Simon Fraser University, who says, and I quote, "What we do know is that GPR can detect anomalies in the soil and that this technology has been used to successfully find unmarked graves. And we also know that children did die at residential schools because there are records of this. And we know that GPR anomalies have been found around residential schools that require further investigation. Oh, and I also spoke to the manufacturing company that makes the technology used inside GPR devices."
How do you counter misinformation? In a word, it's total BS. I mean, it's used all the time for this application. I don't know how else you counter that other than to say, talk to the police who are using it, talk to the researchers who are using it. Now, most of the time, bodies that have been buried for years or decades or hundreds of years are long since dewatered and decayed and everything like that. And they're extremely difficult to find with GPR. In fact, you probably wouldn't be able to find them with GPR. But what you can find is things associated with the burial. So things like somebody had to dig a hole to bury the body, and therefore the soil was disturbed. And you can never put the soil back into a hole the same way it came out. Finding one body buried somewhere is very, very difficult, right? The police run into that all the time with cold cases. Is how do you tell? Because GPR can be very confusing and all this. But when you have basically an unmarked cemetery, which is the situation with the residential schools, then you pick up patterns. When you scan an area, you start to see, hey, wait a minute, this doesn't look totally natural. This is a pattern.
I mean, it sure would damage your entire thesis if it turned out that these exact same techniques of combining GPR data with other information such as historical records had been used to exhume bodies years after they had been buried. You know, like in Tampa Bay, where the remains of over 50 boys were exhumed after having been successfully located with the assistance of ground-penetrating radar over 70 years after the bodies had been buried. I guess your last remaining shred of dignity could hinge on the fact that these weren't exactly residential schools or Indigenous children being exhumed. Unlike the Carlisle Indian Boarding School, one of the oldest residential schools in the United States that opened in 1831 and closed in 1970, and the work of Clint King, who again combined the use of ground-penetrating radar with other information to locate and track Indigenous children that were buried there. And if that isn't all, here's the bodies having been exhumed from the ground and returned to their ancestral homes, you goddamn ghoul, over 100 years later.
But it wouldn't see a pile of bodies that has been there for 60, 70, 80 years. It's just not how GPR works.
Yes, that's right, Ronald McDonald with whiteface on. I haven't forgotten about you. It's actually so rich that you would want to talk about genocide and hoaxes because ground-penetrating radar has been used to find Jewish mass graves from the goddamn Holocaust. GPR is such a crucial tool used in archaeology at this point that stating that it's unable to find skeletal remains is so ludicrous that it calls into question the entire field itself. I mean, yeah, we had medicine before the fact that we knew about what the germ theory of disease was, or antibiotics, but no one is going to say that we shouldn't use those things today. Like, should we not use chemistry just because we once had alchemy, Lauren? Is that what you want? Fucking alchemy?
It cannot detect organic matter. Yeah, you said that.
This was a very difficult video to make. And I don't only mean because I have an Indigenous mother or because of how dark the subject matter is, but because it's something that both Canada and the world are just now coming to terms with. Yet it's something that Indigenous people have been screaming and begging to be heard on for decades. Many people don't realize that the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was created as part of a settlement agreement, and that the Conservative government at the time tried to do everything in their power to delay or stop it. What makes things worse is that even when there's overwhelming amounts of evidence, people like Lauren and person voted most likely to name his mannequins after his mother will deliberately lie and distort the truth to whitewash or hide the horrors and atrocities committed against Indigenous people. So beyond the lesson of don't trust anything Lauren Southern says at face value, the greatest one would be listen to Indigenous voices and storytellers, because theirs are the ones that have been historically silenced.